Good evening, everybody. I'm John OLoughlin, and welcome to my channel. It's called McDuff Lives, and tonight we are broadcasting here from the McDuff chair. This is my dad's Harvard chair, and we'll be reading a little bit and making a few comments because this is a 1 hour review as we do on Wednesday nights here at McDuff Channel. And the author tonight is none other than George Webb, and the book is called Let's Call Him McDuff. So, through the magic of Andy DiBallo's great technical skill, we have the book on one side and me on the other. And I'll be showing some pages from the book. You can see on the front page of the book, George has selected a identification card that I gave him. It's a civil defense card, and it shows that my dad was absolutely essential, imperative that he be assisted in travel to by the fastest possible means to this emergency assignment, whatever it might be. George Webb is back here on Mystery Island, as you know, I think, and I'm really happy to have George back. And he was over here at the studio this afternoon doing a book reading, which is really a great way to absorb George's material because, well, first of all, he puts out books so fast that I can't keep up with him. But secondly, with him actually reading the book on camera, you get to see his body language, his facial expressions, and he adds a number of great personal comments to the text itself that all by themselves would be worth watching. So be sure and watch over at it's Blackberry. Is that right, Andy?
Blackberry Road Show.
Blackberry Road Show is the name of the new configuration from Neighborhood News Studio, which George is a correspondent and commentator with. So, George Webb, my hat's off to you. You did a great job with this book. And, you know, my dad has been both a towering figure, but also an enigma in my life since he died when I was 18 in 1971. And we never really knew anything about his career except for that he worked for SACSA and that he was in the FBI. But some of the stories that I got mainly came from my mother. Obviously, he would share some things with our mother, but not with us as little kids. And one of those stories has my dad chasing Russians down Indian Head Highway, Maryland Route 210, from the DC line down to Bryan's Road, Maryland, where there was a famous, well, it was called Blackie's. It was called Smitty's Steakhouse, and became Blackie's later, but it was Smitty's Steakhouse at the time in Indian Head, Maryland, and we're talking about in the 50s, the late 50s. And one of the things about coming down to Southern Maryland at the time was that they had slot machines. So Bryan's Road was the next town over the Charles County line after you came through Oxon Hill and Fort Washington and Accokeek, and then you would cross the Charles County line, and there you would be in a little town called Bryan's Road, and there was Smitty's Steakhouse, and in there were the slot machines. And that was the destination of the Russians that my dad was chasing because the Russians, it seems, had a taste for the slot machines. So my dad learned to do his surveillance of the Russians by going to the various slot machine joints in Southern Maryland. And often it would involve dinner. We'd go out and have dinner, and they'd go in and play the slots. And I didn't know it at the time, but he was probably keeping his eye on a couple of his targets. So that kind of story is fun and fascinating, and I have a handful of those. I wish I had more, but the ones that I have, I do cherish them, and I've shared with George as we got to know each other and walked the walk together and spent the last 3.5-4 years now among his many other journeys, the journey into McDuff's life. And that, as he described today, as he was talking about it in our early days, we I was sharing with him my preliminary research, and part of that was all about the Fort Hunt Agreement and Reinhard Gehlen. And George got very, very interested in it, and we followed around different places where my father would have been, or to try to reconstruct what he was doing, who he was. Well, George has now created an incredible portrait of my dad in this book called Let's Call Him McDuff. And true to form, George is always on the cusp of new information. So the things that are in this book are actually, many of them are new to me, but they make sense to me based upon my dad's character, who he was, and the positions that he held, both at the FBI and at the Pentagon. So let's call him McDuff color version. DNC emails Seth Rich and a man called McDuff is the first chapter. And let me just read a little bit of this for you. This book will present a secret CIA memorandum called the McCone Memorandum about Lee Harvey Oswald, which obsoletes every other book written on the subject. You will find the McCone Memorandum outlines Oswald's involvement with the CIA from 1957 to 1963. You'll also be presented with information that FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover was compiling a dossier on Lee Harvey Oswald as early as June 1960, 3.5 years before the Kennedy assassination. Now, that is huge to Kennedy researchers. I really look forward to seeing the reaction of the well-entrenched community of Kennedy writers and researchers to what George is putting together here on that. This book is about a man, J. Edgar Hoover, assigned to figure this puzzle out, a man we call McDuff. You will also see how President Kennedy brought our McDuff over to the Pentagon to work for the Joint Chiefs of Staff to figure out who was behind the Bay of Pigs invasion. And then we have the McCone Memorandum. George then talks about the plans for a second invasion of Cuba, the 1962 invasion, which was the result of my dad being transferred over to SACSA from the FBI at Kennedy's request, because they knew he had the military planning experience to plan amphibious operations such as the Leyte Gulf invasion with General MacArthur. So my dad goes over to the Pentagon and becomes the counterinsurgency planner, was his title, or just planner, if you will. And he worked in the part of SACSA called special plans. That's what they called it. So he was the planner for operations carried on by the Joint Chiefs of Staff in response to Kennedy's order that took away the CIA's authority to conduct special operations and reverted it to the Pentagon. So there's a letter from J. Edgar Hoover congratulating him on his Secretary of Defense Civilian Meritorious Service Award, which was given to him a couple of months before he died. Let's call him McDuff, I said to the amateur historian and Georgetown trial lawyer named John OLoughlin after he told me one of the most fascinating G-Man versus Russian spy stories I'd ever heard. I'd just met OLoughlin 3 hours earlier while walking the bloodstained last footsteps of Seth Rich's last moments alive in Washington, D.C.'s Bloomingdale neighborhood. And indeed, that is what happened. George was known to me from watching his YouTubes for maybe 2 or 3 months. I can't remember. It was when he was just using his hands. If you remember that part, there was like a number 63 or something. That's where I came in. But enough of his reporting sounded like he would have a handle on what I told him if I went to talk to him. And so, although I was very, very shy and nervous about telling my dad's story or what I knew to anybody, and really, was I just sticking my neck out for nothing? Because maybe a lot of this is just me speculating, but I felt it was worth it, so I called him up and, actually talked to Jason because they were together. That was like, maybe the last week they were still working together. But, I went down to meet the both of them, and, Jason excused himself. George and I sat and, talked for a good 3 or 4 hours, from everything from Shakespeare to, history, and telling him my dad's story a little bit. Um, this is a nice picture of me as I started my show, I guess 2.5 years ago now. Um, Started my show again to support George because George got taken down by YouTube. That was the first big strike that any of us got. That was a huge hit for George because he had, like, I don't know if it was like 100,000 or some subscribers. And, as I know very well, when you get hit, it's very hard to build up a following like that. And so that was a big thing. And I said, well, I'm going to start a channel then, and you come over here and keep doing what you're doing. Just do it here on my channel. And that's how we got started working together. And that that has really just changed my life in the most wonderful way because now I have not only George, but an incredible network of people of different expertises and different experiences, and that can help me see things, help me learn things, and think things from different angles. The folks that have been kind enough to join me on my show have just been so generous with their time and their expertise. So I'm feeling like I'm in the best place I've been in my whole life, really, just absorbing the assistance I get from people that are dedicated to preserving the story of people like my dad, who basically didn't have anything in him that was going to allow him to do the things that they wanted him to do. He was just he didn't have it in his character to do things like Alan Dulles or Richard Bissell or Frank Wisner or Richard Helms or so many of the people, Angleton, that were definitely in his life, and not for good either, not for good, because it turned out very, very, very tragically for my dad, but not before he laid a lot of groundwork for what we're doing now, and that is restoring his picture, restoring his life story, and bringing it out so that people can understand through his story, America's story. What happened to our country is, I think, very well told through the eyes of a McDuff. I, George Webb, a newly arrived journalist in the DC area, was doing background research for a series of television shows about the death of Seth Rich, the supposed slain hero of leaking the the Hillary DNC emails to WikiLeaks. Mr. O'Loughlin intercepted me and said he would like to share his dad's story with me because it concerned the FBI and the CIA. O'Loughlin thought there might have been foul play in his father's early death after a career at the highest levels of the FBI and the Joint Chiefs of Staff. And there's my dad, if you can bring that picture up. That's him at a party, a formal party that was for General Victor Krulak, as when, I don't know if it was when Krulak was appointed the SAXA, the special assistant special for counterinsurgency and special operations, special activities, SACSA, SACSA, or some other occasion, but it is very rare that my dad and my mom would get dressed up formally and go to a official event from the Pentagon. But that was at one of these events, so you can see him in his black tie. His father was an FBI man and a close associate of FBI Chief J. Edgar Hoover. And McDuff, as I call the G Man, seemed to be involved in similar intrigues as Seth Rich. Not only was there a telltale ring to Seth Rich's whistleblower death at the DNC, but McDuff was also involved in keeping an eye on Russian spies as they combed the Washington, D.C. area. It's so interesting with the Russian spies that they had a radius of 35 miles from the capital in which they could operate. They could just act like regular people. So there was the Russian retreat over there in Centerville, which we visited on a boat trip with George, and that he had previously gone to on a kayak that we all thought he was going to die in a tornado. But anyway, we got out there and saw this beautiful old mansion, and George explained to us all about how the Russian spies would live there, and the FBI knew it. It was like they had permission, and there's a beach on this side of the bay called what was it called? Was it anyway? The idea that there was Russians that were all around the Washington D.C. area, and they had permission to be there as long as they didn't go more than 35 miles from the center of the city. So that was my dad's FBI job, was following them around and reporting on them. I'm sure a lot of intrigue that we'll never know about. In addition to that, um, we interlaced Russian espionage in D.C. history with banter about the recent Hillary DNC email baiting to the Trump campaign, comparing her to Lady Macbeth. Was Hillary trying to rinse Seth Rich's bloodstains off her hands? Did Hillary and the longtime FBI henchman Andrew McCabe fake Seth Rich's death to drip blood all over the DNC emails to make them juicier bait for the Trump campaign? The Macbeth analogy became extended as we discussed all the Russia DNC email intrigues near the supposed last bloody footprints of Seth Rich. Eventually, we got around to the end of Macbeth, and I summarized what the DNC email story needs is a McDuff like your dad. Let's call your dad McDuff. How would he have handled this DNC email lure case? I gave O'Loughlin's father the name of McDuff right there and then, the hero who comes in at the end of Macbeth to put the world right again. Over the next 3 years of incredible investigation, we would ask ourselves again and again, what would McDuff do? Chapter 2 is about the DNC case and the Rockefeller compromise dinners. 3.5 years have gone by since that first lunch with our McDuff's son, and I've talked to John OLoughlin every week during that period. During the past year, I moved to the same small southern Maryland island as OLoughlin to do a daily television show with him, where coincidentally, the ex-CIA director William Colby took his last paddle in his canoe before drowning in a suspicious death. John and I have learned a lot more about his father, Thomas Francis O'Loughlin, the man I call McDuff, in those 3.5 years. I'm sure John OLoughlin will author a more linear book cataloging the incredible things we found out in those 3 years. However, I have the advantage of distance and perspective as an independent reporter to draw parallels to today. For instance, one of my favorite questions is, if he were alive today, how would McDuff stop the latest Trump coup? Well, that's an interesting question. What if what if my dad was alive now or when the Trump coup happened? I tell you, he would have been um, incensed. He would have been absolutely incensed at the idea that our elections could be tampered with by fraud. He was, if you think I'm kind of a straight person about, follow, stay with the Constitution, follow the instructions, he was very, very, he hated the idea of corruption. He hated it. One time we were talking about traveling to New York, and I remember him saying that he just didn't want to travel through New Jersey. Why? Um, well, he said that he was sad to say it, but that he had learned that the government was corrupt there, and he didn't want to spend any money there. And I thought, that's him. I I agree with him. It's just that he was such a man of principle that he didn't even want to set foot in the state once he determined, that it was corrupt. Now, as we were doing our shows, we got hints from people that had various new things that neither George nor I knew. And one of them dropped in the chat on my YouTube channel one time the information that my dad was in this book called Cassidy's Run, written by David Wise. And, David Wise is one of the most important writers on espionage and the history of espionage in the 60s and 70s and 80s. And this book is what I'm reading right now on the show. Well, let's just let George tell it. I can guarantee you that when I met John OLoughlin, he did not know his father was involved in passing fake secrets to the Russians in Operation Shocker that would lead to the development of poison that Prokhorov, Bill Browder, and other DNC figures would use 30 years later to poison their old Russian business partners. Operation Shocker is described in the great David Wise's book called Cassidy's Run, which I hardly recommend. The most shocking aspect of this story only starts here. Prokhorov is part of a cadre of white Russian Jewish operatives that the Rockefeller family cultivated inside Russia for the inevitable broker off day when the Soviet Union collapsed. Not only did our McDuff go to the same Connecticut prep school as two of the famous four Rockefeller sons at Loomis Preparatory School, but that same school was also attended by classmates directly by the man who hosted Lee Harvey Oswald in Dallas, Texas, before the Kennedy assassination. The Loomis School also matriculated one of the most famous Rockefeller white Russian spy recruiting families ever, the de Mohrenschildt family of Lee Harvey Oswald fame. And George de Mohrenschildt's lap was the lap that none other than Jackie Kennedy grew up on, calling de Mohrenschildt Uncle George for most of her childhood years. Was our McDuff feeding poisoned secrets to Rockefeller white Russian spies in Russia to infiltrate the Politburo, to cause the Soviet Union to collapse from within? We don't know yet the answer to that question, but we certainly know that Prokhorov used that same Rockefeller poison to eliminate their joint Russian joint venture after the fall of the Soviet Union. Then, in the middle of the 2016 campaign, with the DNC dangling the emails to the Trump campaign about these sordid Hillary Russian joint ventures, we saw none other than John D. Rockefeller IV hosting monthly dinners with a later generation of white Russian spy girls in the middle of Washington, D.C., inviting anyone with dress shoes in the Trump campaign to attend and be compromised. An even more incredible twist now presented itself. After the death of President Kennedy, the newly minted President Johnson sent his special investigator, William Sullivan, to scour all the intelligence agencies for Lee Harvey Oswald and Jack Ruby's connections to Russia. Who is in charge of the Oswald and Ruby investigation to report to the Warren Commission? Our McDuff. The Warren Commission chose William Sullivan to lead the investigation of the Kennedy assassination. The key investigator of both Lee Harvey Oswald and Jack Ruby was McDuff. Both OLoughlin and myself have traveled to interview authors who know about the Rockefeller White Russian connections in New Orleans and Dallas to Jack Ruby's two strip clubs. All roads seem to lead to a trade organization called the Perm Index and its famous offspring, the New Orleans Trade Mart and the Dallas Trade Mart. The former was where Oswald handed out Fair Play for Cuba committee leaflets, and the latter being the destination where Kennedy was en route before his assassination. I, George Webb, maintained that the Perm Index and Trade Marts were trade exhibitions funneling points for Nazi paperclip scientists and Rockefeller White Russian spies for infiltration into energy, defense, and transportation businesses, America style. Hoover's man to collect dossiers for key defense industry clearances was, you guessed it, our McDuff. You could not pack more intrigue into the life of McDuff if you tried, but there is more still. The masterminds behind placing all these Nazi paperclip scientists into energy and defense industries to develop White Russian spies and assassins are CIA Director Allen Dulles, the quintessential Nazi spy master Reinhard Gehlen, and the Rockefeller White Russian spy master himself, Henry Kissinger. In the one and only espionage case in the history of the United States State Department, Kissinger is accused by a white Russian named Golenievsky of bringing in 262 white Russian spies into the United States for Rockefeller. The only time Senate hearings were held concerning the loyalty of Henry Kissinger to the United States, who was the FBI agent in charge of the espionage case, McDuff. So this is our McDuff. Thomas Francis OLoughlin. Want to find out more? Enjoy the story of McDuff, a truly great American hero. There's one of my favorite pictures of my dad there. He's standing on the ship, the USS Nashville, and you can tell that he's happy. He's enjoying the Navy life. My dad wanted to stay in the Navy, and after the war, everybody was discharged. They didn't need a huge military anymore. And but my dad was one of the few officers that was reserve officers in U.S. Navy Reserve that was offered a commission in the regular Navy, and that his captain at the time, Captain Atherton McCondray, wrote him a letter congratulating him and looking forward to welcoming him into the regular Navy. But sadly, my dad had to decline that for what he called family reasons. There was trouble at home, and he was needed, so he went home and instead went to law school, which I suppose I'm lucky that he did, or else I wouldn't be here. The investigations McDuff was involved in are fascinating subjects for me. McDuff was involved in a Russian defector case called the Golenievsky case. Golenievsky implicated Henry Kissinger, saying he made empty promises to his clan of white Russian generals. Golenievsky and his Polish pilots may have been part of a plan for a second invasion of Cuba after the Bay of Pigs, launching from Miami airfields at a CIA training base called JM Wave. And I'm sure you've probably heard of that before. There's a picture of Golenievsky. Golenievsky. I'm sorry, I'm terrible at um, Polish and Slavic names generally. I'm sorry for that. Um, well, the next section of the book moves into Stephen Kinser's book, Poisoner in Chief. And the sad thing about that is I do find that in reading Poisoner in Chief, I came over the doubts that I'd had that they had poisoned my dad, because in that book it explains how um, they would that they used LSD in the mind control programs, right? And the use of LSD and also things that like adrenaline and things that you can read about what they did at Montreal. It's just horrible, the things that they did to people. Well, the symptoms were apparent in my dad. I was what, 13, 14, 15 years old, and the change in him was just terrible. He was extremely irrational sometimes, and we didn't understand why. He was hardly there, and when he was there, it was very difficult for especially for my little sister, who was just too young to try to understand, that he was under a terrific strain at work. This is the time when the Sante raid is going on, for instance. You imagine how he would be having to concentrate on that, but at the same time, you've got people like Alan Dulles trying to control him. And one of the things that they did is, in my opinion, is they poisoned him with um, hepatitis through the shellfish poison that they have. And it turns out from Stephen Kinser's book, Poisoner in Chief, that the CIA knew that people who had hepatitis were more easily controlled under LSD. See, they had done all these experiments, and they knew this from a report from Sandoz in Switzerland that had reported it. So now I can look back and say, aha, now that's why they gave him the hepatitis, to set him up for the mind control with the drugs, and that's what I do believe happened. So that's the sad part of my dad's story. But when we finally can prove this, when we can finally put it all together into what would really be a legal case, even if the statutes run, it's still a case worth showing of what happened, what happened to Frank Olson in the book The Terrible Mistake. This is a similar type of a story that I think needs to be told. So when we put it all together, I think the story itself is going to change everybody's view of the CIA, and possibly push us in the direction that I think, my whole instinct is that we need to shut that place down. Um, we might need their functions used in some other way. We may need we might need surveillance. We might need lots of things, but we do not need this cloak and dagger, behind the scenes manipulation of people's lives and destruction of families, and these horrible, horrible things that they've been doing, in the name of whatever they're doing. It doesn't. It We need some way to wake everybody up. And to the extent that me and George and the Ospreys that work with us can do that, I want it out there. I want the story told. So I think George Webb has performed a wonderful service here in explaining to us what he sees, things that I couldn't see. Let's Call Him McDuff. It's 1995 on Amazon, and I'll be the first to admit that some of what George says here, I can't verify it, but it's definitely a very, very reasonable thing to project that what George is saying, as we've been saying since George and I met, um, he lays the track, and then other people can come and trestle under and put the trestles underneath of it. We're doing that. It's an ongoing exposition of the wonderful character, the wonderful life of my father, but also we're going to have to tell the dark side too. And well, I think I'll leave it right there. George Webb, uh, wonderful investigator, and he's become a true friend. So I highly recommend Let's Call Him McDuff, the color version by George Webb. Thanks again.